Of all the arguments for a god, the ontological argument is, in my not so humble opinion, the absolute worst. In fact, I seriously struggle to fathom how anyone of any intelligence could possibly find it convincing. And yet, despite many people, including many religious people, also finding the ontological argument to be absurdly pathetic, it still remains extremely popular among apologists, but not so popular among general theists, and maybe there's a reason for this. Anyhow, likewise to most theistic arguments, there are many versions of the ontological argument, which differ in the language they use and in some cases, the premises they rely upon. Hence, I may in the future create additional videos to address the alternative versions, but for this video I'm going to address the most popular version, the first version, as defined by Anselm in 1077. So, to present the ontological argument in its logical state. It is a conceptual truth, or so to speak, true by definition, that God is a being than which none greater can be imagined. That is, the greatest possible being that can be imagined. God exists as an idea in the mind. A being that exists as an idea in the mind and reality is, other things being equal, greater than a being that exists only as an idea in the mind. Thus, if God exists only as an idea in the mind, then we can imagine something that is greater than God. That is, a greatest possible being that does exist. But we cannot imagine something that is greater than God, for it is a contradiction to suppose that we can imagine a being greater than the greatest possible being that can be imagined. Therefore, God exists. Convinced? If you are, then I can't help you, and neither can Jesus. But I'm gonna try anyway. So what exactly is wrong with the ontological argument? What fallacies does it commit, and what objections can be made? Or more accurately, what fallacy does it not commit, and what objections can't be made? Well, first and foremost, and arguably the most important objection, was put forward by a contemporary of Anselm called Gaunilo, who pointed out that by simply replacing the term greatest being with greatest island, you can prove that there must be a greatest island, or a greatest beer, and so on. Effectively, Gaunilo used the technique of Reductio Ad Absurdum, more commonly known as reduction to the absurd or appeal to extremes, to demonstrate this flaw in Anselm's argument. To go further with the Reductio Ad Absurdum technique, we can demonstrate that the ontological argument's reasoning can be used to prove the existence of the greatest evil being, which would necessarily be greater than the greatest good being. What's more is that the same reasoning can be used to prove that a perfectly irresistible force exists, and that so does a perfectly immovable object, which is an impossible contradiction. Effectively, and to put it bluntly, Gaunilo tentatively granted all of the premises and the conclusion of Anselm's ontological argument, and still demonstrated the argument to be flawed, which in philosophy is about as humiliating a defeat can be. It's a slam dunk, it's a knockout, it's game over. However, in response to this evisceration, Anselm retorted with the assertion that unlike the perfect island or the perfect beer, etc., God is a necessary being. To put it simply, Anselm defined a necessary being to be a being that cannot not be. He justified this by first asserting that the universe had a first cause, which he didn't substantiate and hence committed a special pleading fallacy. And he then asserted that this first cause must be a being, which, again, he didn't substantiate and hence he failed to fulfill his burden of proof. And he then asserted that this being must be a necessary being, because it is the only thing to exist that wasn't brought into existence by a cause, which would be correct, if only the previous two premises were true, which they're not. A second objection with Anselm's ontological argument is that it misuses language. Premise 1 states that God is a being than which none greater can be imagined, but this is simply incorrect. Rather, God is a conceptual being than which none greater can be imagined. Minds don't conceive beings, they conceive concepts of beings, in the same way that painters don't paint trees, they paint paintings off trees. Premise 2 states that God exists as an idea in the mind, but this too is incorrect. Rather, a concept of God exists as an idea in the mind. Of course, I realise that this may sound pedantic, but when it comes to logical arguments, it is paramount that the correct language and definition of words and terms are used. lest one wants to run the risk of committing, among other errors, an equivocation fallacy. But while we're on the topic of running the risk of committing an equivocation fallacy, the ontological argument commits one even if we ignore its misuse of language. For those of you unfamiliar or in need of a recap, a fallacy of equivocation occurs when the definition of a word or a phrase that is critical to the conclusion of an argument is switched during the course of that argument. For example, and to use a popular one that you've very likely heard before, laws imply lawgivers, there are laws in nature, therefore there must be a cosmic lawgiver. Sure, lawgivers create laws, and there are indeed laws within nature, but we use two very different definitions of the word law when we say these statements, and to pretend otherwise is at best a misuse of language, and at worst a pitiful and contemptible lie. The same is true of those who claim to have faith in you like they have faith in their deity. They are using two different definitions of the word faith, whether they recognise this or not. But to get back on track, in the case of Anselm's ontological argument, the fallacy of equivocation resides in the word God. During point 2, Anselm uses a definition consistent with a conceptual God who exists only in the mind. But in point 5 he uses a definition consistent with a God who exists in reality. It might seem subtle, but this is a rife example of an equivocation fallacy. A fourth major problem with the ontological argument, and one that was first voiced by Immanuel Kant, is that it commits the fallacy of begging the question. It does this because the conclusion of the argument is included in one of its premises, making it circular reasoning. Or to paraphrase Kant, it attempts to cause something to exist by adding existence to its definition. A great example to illustrate this issue can be seen in the Messianic Manix video, which I provided a link to below. But to paraphrase his example, a realicorn is by definition a unicorn that exists. It exists by definition. Therefore, if you have a fully accurate understanding of what a realicorn is, you must believe that it exists. Because if you're thinking about a realicorn that doesn't exist, you're not actually thinking about a realicorn, you're just thinking about a unicorn. If you were to say that a realicorn doesn't exist, you'd be making a contradiction, because the realicorn exists by definition. The realicorn exists because the realicorn exists by definition. Just as in the ontological argument, God exists because God exists by definition. This is especially true when the necessary being card is in play. While we're on the point of defining things into existence, a fifth major problem with the ontological argument is that it treats the word existence as if it were an attribute of something, rather than the condition that allows for attributes to apply to something. Something existing in the mind is conceptual and may or may not reference something that exists in the real world. Or, as Scott Clifton puts it, in his outstandingly clear way, and whose content I've also linked to in the description, to say that anything has any attribute at all is to already say that it exists, otherwise you're just speaking of the attributes it would have had if it existed. And while we're on the topic of Clifton, and to raise a sixth objection, Anselm fails to define and emphasise the relevancy of the word greater. To briefly paraphrase Clifton on this point, one can conceive of a being greater than the Abrahamic God, because one can conceive of a being that doesn't commit genocide, sanction wars, or slaughter the firstborn of an entire country because their king was stubborn. Of course, similar to all theistic arguments, there are many more problems with the ontological argument, and different and indeed better ways to convey the few that I've raised. But to summarise the flaws we've covered in this video, Anselm's ontological argument is flawed because it's applicable to countless mutually exclusive concepts, as demonstrated when exposed to the Reductio Ad Absurdum technique. It misuses language, it commits an equivocation fallacy, it commits a begging the question fallacy, it treats existence as if it were an attribute of something rather than the condition that allows for attributes to apply to something, and it fails to define the word greater. So, like I said, if you find the ontological argument convincing, I can't help you, and neither can the giant spaghetti monster. Here's a quick interlude before I give you an overwhelmingly powerful argument to consider. But I'd just like to give away a copy of Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, as a thank you for your support so far. It's a fantastic book, and it just so happens to be the first book I ever read on atheism. To enter, all you have to do is be subscribed, like this video and make a comment and you'll be automatically entered into a random draw. And hence, if you're watching this in the future, the competition will be over. Anyhow, as always, thank you for taking the time to view my content, and I'll leave you with this overwhelmingly powerful argument to consider. It is a conceptual truth, or, so to speak, true by definition, that having you subscribe to my channel is a gift than which none greater can be imagined. That is, the greatest possible gift that can be imagined. Your subscription exists as an idea in my mind. Having you subscribe to me as an idea in the mind and reality is, other things being equal, greater than having you subscribe to me as only an idea in the mind. Thus, if you subscribe to me only as an idea in the mind, then I can imagine a gift that is greater than you subscribing to me only as an idea in the mind. That is, a subscription that does exist. But I cannot imagine a gift greater than you subscribing to my channel, for it is a contradiction to suppose that I can imagine a gift to be greater than the greatest gift that can be imagined. Therefore, you subscribe to me. I'm not gonna lie, these overwhelmingly powerful arguments are getting hard to create.